28 years later would have been a radically different sequel if it was announced just 5 years earlier. 28 Years Later is one of the most highly anticipated horror sequels of the decade, with original director Danny Boyle and writer Alex Garland reuniting to resurrect the virus-ravaged world of 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later. But what if this sequel had been greenlit not in 2024, but back in 2019? As it turns out, a 5-year difference would have dramatically altered its tone, message, characters, and cultural context. In many ways, 28 Years Later would have been a radically different film if it had come just 5 years earlier, and possibly even a very different kind of horror story. 1. The pandemic wouldn't have been personal. Announcing 28 years later, before the real-world COVID-19 pandemic, would have placed it in a very different emotional and psychological landscape. Before 2020, audiences viewed viral outbreaks as fictional or distant threats. The rage virus was a terrifying cinematic device, but it wasn't something viewers related to firsthand. Had the movie arrived in 2019, it might have leaned heavily into speculative dystopia without the added weight of global trauma. Instead, the post-COVID audience brings a collective understanding of lockdowns, isolation, fear of infection, and government missteps. These real-life parallels inevitably inform both the creative direction and audience reception of 28 Years Later today. In 2019, it could have remained a high-concept, fast-paced horror without confronting real societal wounds. 2. Streaming wouldn't have dominated the conversation. If the film had been announced in 2019, the expectation would have been for a traditional theatrical release, maybe even a summer horror blockbuster. There wouldn't have been as much pressure to consider streaming-first distribution strategies. But post-2020, the rise of streaming platforms like Netflix, Hulu, and Max reshaped the film industry. Now, studios develop many titles with dual release models or prioritize streaming exclusives, especially for genre films. Had 28 Years Later emerged earlier, it might have been aimed squarely at the box office and structured for a tighter runtime, wider theatrical appeal, and a more action-driven pace. Today, it could take on a more layered, episodic feel, or even be considered for a trilogy model spanning streaming and theatrical hybrids. 3. Franchise fatigue wasn't a concern yet. In 2019, the appetite for sequels, reboots, and franchise continuations was still robust, with major IPs like Star Wars, Marvel, and Game of Thrones dominating the cultural landscape. Had 28 Years Later been announced then, it could have ridden the wave of cinematic nostalgia without facing today's more jaded audiences who have grown weary of endless sequels and soft reboots. In 2024 and beyond, however, there's a noticeable pushback against content that exists purely to capitalize on IP. For 28 Years Later to succeed now, it must not only continue the story, but justify its existence artistically. This challenge may force Boyle and Garland to push the story in a more philosophical or emotionally grounded direction. 4. Different political climate, different themes. In 2019, the political backdrop was different. The UK was in the throes of Brexit uncertainty, and American politics were defined by intense polarization. But the themes of misinformation, border control, and militarization hadn't yet been filtered through the lens of a real-world pandemic. Announced earlier, 28 Years Later might have featured more overt metaphors about nationalism or authoritarianism. Today, with widespread disillusionment about institutional competence during global crises, the themes may skew more towards survivalism, resilience, and mistrust of government narratives, echoing how public trust has shifted post-2020. 5. The cast would have looked different. 5 years ago, the cast and creative team might have leaned into different stars. Cillian Murphy, though always respected, hadn't yet become an Oscar-winning,